Very sorry for that. I'll repeat the beginning part very quickly just for our online audience. But thank you again for inviting me to speak here in Venice. Today I'll be introducing the forms of loyalty in pre-modern Japan. My lecture will consist of 3 parts: an introductory section in which I introduce my theoretical framework, a broad historical analysis of warriors in pre-modern Japan, and finally, the analysis of the loyalty of a single warrior house. So this lecture draws upon my doctoral research, which focused on House Hosokawa and loyalty in 16th century Japan. So loyalty is highly sought by both individuals and institutions. Hard-pressed to find a leader, government, or corporate that doesn't consider loyalty desirable. Those who invoke loyalty typically do so for their own benefit. For instance, Donald Trump once stated that I value loyalty above everything else, more than brains, more than drive, and more than energy. It's unsurprising then that the enforcement and rewarding of loyalty have become institutionalized. In the UK, whips ensure that members of parliament remain loyal to the party line, and the most loyal MPs are offered rewards like damehoods, knighthoods, life peerages, spots in the aristocracy. Warlords in pre-modern Japan were no different. Their political fortunes were inextricably linked to their ability to secure the loyalty of other warriors, and thus necessity dictated that they develop systems to rein in and reward their retainers. Loyalty is generally placed within and downright immoral in others. One US politician speaks of the poison of loyalty in democracy. I'm not going to comment on whether loyalty, in my view, is righteous or is good or not. I'm more concerned with how warriors in pre-modern Japan understood loyalty and with the place of loyalty in their moral system. Although it's very easy and So I'll begin by introducing my theoretical framework, which is constituted by 3 forms of loyalty: emotional, teleological, and deontological loyalty. The form of loyalty that most of you will recognize is emotional loyalty. Emotional loyalty is that which impels most of us to protect our family and support our favorite sports teams, regardless of how poorly they might be playing. Emotional loyalty is not always rational. It's not always grounded in self-interest or a code of ethics. In the case of emotional loyalty, emotion is that which is driving us to be loyal to an individual, group, or entity. Emotional loyalty is the least reducible, yet it's also the most potent. At its very strongest, it's capable of triumphing over reason, duty, and even self-interest. However, emotional loyalty is also the most difficult to instill in others. The primary aim of this presentation is describing the genesis and development of teleological and deontological loyalty in pre-modern Japan. So I'll begin with an explanation of these 2 forms. So teleological loyalty represents a means to an end. You might be teleological loyal to a particular political party, because you believe that that party is most likely to bring about a certain outcome, like social justice or world peace. When self-interest is the sole motivation, we find ourselves with what I call transactional loyalty, which is a subdivision of teleological loyalty. Transactional loyalty is often invoked by businesses. So a takeaway establishment, a carry-out establishment in Yorkshire in the UK, which is promoting its loyalty club program, says, "Love eating here? Get rewarded for your loyalty." Upon exiting an airplane last year, I was greeted with this recorded message: "We appreciate your continued loyalty to Delta Airlines." Transactional loyalty is at times deliberately covered with a veneer of emotional loyalty. A vice president might present his loyalty to the president as emotional, even devotional in nature, even if self-interest really underlies his loyalty. Politicians in democracies across the globe invoke teleological or transactional loyalty when soliciting votes. Posters and websites list concrete actions to be taken by the candidate, and these actions are framed first and foremost as being beneficial to the country and to the people. So deontological loyalty, what I call deontological loyalty, is grounded in duty. That duty impels one to be loyal and is invoked by those seeking the deontological loyalty of others. Loyalty to country and family are perhaps the most prominent examples of this type of loyalty, though loyalty to family can also be emotional or teleological in nature. Deontological loyalty often works in tandem with other forms of loyalty. Joseph and Magna Goebbels, who infamously murdered their children with cyanide the day after Hitler's suicide, may have been motivated by both the sense of duty and emotion to end their lives and the lives of their children in 1945. That their loyalty to Hitler went beyond self-interest, is revealed in a letter that Magda wrote to her son via a previous marriage, Harald Quandt. "We have only one aim in life now, to remain loyal to the Führer until death. That we should be able to end our life together with him is a gift of fate for which we would never have dared hope." So this, in my mind, leaves little doubt that a sense of duty underlay the loyalty of Magda and Joseph Goebbels to Hitler. In their minds, Hitler embodied the German state. Still, Magna's missive here suggests that emotion, too, motivated their decision to devote themselves so entirely to their leader. The invocation of duty by individuals, groups, and entities seeking the loyalty of others was also very common in 20th century Europe. The first advertisement aimed at prospective enlistees in the UK in 1914, the beginning of World War I, read, "Your king and country need you." So this catchphrase, which is superimposed in bold uppercase letters over the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom, is a perfect example of a government seeking the deontological loyalty of its subjects. Many of those who enlisted might have been driven to do so by emotional, deontological, or teleological loyalty, or perhaps by some sort of combination of the three. So I've developed this theoretical framework to serve as a lens through which to analyze warrior conduct in pre-modern Japan, but I believe it could be applied to other periods and societies. In sum, I hold that this framework is capable of reducing any instance of loyalty or appeal for loyalty to its motivating factors. There's no particular hierarchy within my framework. One form of loyalty is not necessarily better or stronger than another. So the historian David Spafford, who was trained at La Sapienza before taking his doctorate in the US in medieval Japanese history, introduces a key social axiom, which was articulated by the warlord Uesugi Sadamasa in 1489. Loyalty is service. chūsetsu wa hōko no koto nari. This simple statement allows us to reach sort of a definition of loyalty in the context of pre-modern Japan. Service, military or otherwise, rendered to one's lord. This definition is fully compatible with my framework, as such service can be reasonably construed as being motivated by emotion, self-interest, or a sense of duty. So with this rule, that loyalty is service in mind, I'd like to consider the forms of loyalty in pre-modern Japan with the aim of pinning down a shift from a society dominated by transactional loyalty to one that's characterized by a balance between transactional and deontological loyalty, which we would associate with the Edo period. So the 17-article constitution, which was purportedly promulgated ruin. Therefore, it is when that the Lord speaks, the vassal listens. When the superior acts, the inferior yields compliance. Consequently, when you receive the imperial commands, fail not to carry them out scrupulously. Let there be a want of care in this matter, and ruin is the natural consequence. So this article is framed teleologically. It outlines the negative consequences of failing to be loyal. Its focus isn't solely on the self. Everyone, including the self, are beneficiaries of loyalty to the imperial house, and all would be negatively affected. What this article calls ruin. This suggests, I think, that by the 7th century, authority was justified teleologically rather than through a sense of duty or through emotion. It would take several centuries for the warrior, the bushi, to achieve political influence, let alone political dominance. Some have argued that the warrior age began with the creation of the first bushi-led government, the Kamakura shogunate, in the late 12th century. However, recent scholars contend that despite the growing influence of the warrior class in the 12th and 13th centuries, only in the 14th century did warriors actually come to enjoy true dominance. So the Kamakura age, from 1185 to 1333, was characterized by shared rulership, with 3 blocks sharing the responsibilities of governance. The court, fulfilling administrative duties, the shogunate, taking charge of military matters, and the religious establishment, major Buddhist temples, like Engakuji and Koyasan. Shared rulership ended once the Kamakura shogunate was toppled by the ambitious emperor Go-Daigo, although he was then challenged by Ashikaga Takauji. This led to a period during which 2 rival courts, one in the north and one in the south, Nambokcho, vied for supremacy. One of the courts was in Kyoto and was aligned with the new shogunate that was led by the Ashikaga family, and the other court was led by the emperor Go-Daigo. So the fragmentation of power in 14th century Japan served as a fertile ground for the development of transactional loyalty, which is again a form of teleological loyalty with self-interest alone at its core. Although self-interest surely motivated the loyalty of most warriors, it was commonly covered with a veneer of nobility and honor, which is visible in an appeal for payment issued by Aso Kuresumi in the early 1350s. Having accrued merit in more than 100 battles since the Genko era, and in order to continue to exert myself in loyal service, I wish to be granted landholdings. Since the Genko era, Koresumi, of no great renown, has fought several hundred battles and submitted battle reports. He's even received imperial edicts. Since the beginning of this conflict, Koresumi has demonstrated his loyalty on the battlefield, unceasingly aiding members of both his and other lineages. Other men, even those who've surrendered or are simply members of families that have accrued merit through their loyal service for our forces, have all received landholdings. It's easy to speak of honor, but Koresumi has not received a single landholding, even exhausted, and continues and struggles to perform unceasing service. Koresumi's inability to continue serving would render worthless his previous loyal service. In addition, his homelands and new rewards were not confirmed when his rival Aso Koretoki allied with the southern court. Furthermore, tax-exempt paddies within these holdings were taken from us and restored to the Aso shrine this past autumn. Our exhaustion increases. We wish to be granted to land in this or some other province. Such a grant would support our military forces depleted after many years and allow us to perform increasingly loyal service from now on. So the tendency of the 14th century warrior to desert his master inspired one historian over 100 years ago to proclaim that the middle of the 14th century in Japan was the golden age, not merely of turncoats, but of mediocrities. Yet I think this document suggests that warriors were very aware of notions of honor and loyalty, and they were willing to cite those notions of honor when requesting landholdings and other rewards. So Koresumi's invocation of loyalty could be interpreted as a rhetorical device rather than an actual display of loyalty. Even so, I think his use of the character chūsetsu, chūko, gunchu, in this letter reflects the Confucian conception of loyalty that had been recognized in Japan since at least the time of the 17-article constitution in the 7th century. So move on to the next period. The Muromachi period saw the emergence of a relatively free and powerful warrior class. The Ashikaga family established their headquarters in Muromachi in Kyoto, which is much, much closer to the imperial court than Kamakura is, which is, of course, much closer to Tokyo. Even though the Muromachi shogunate's size was much greater than its predecessor, it wasn't without its own weaknesses. The Muromachi shogunate was politically weak and divided because it relied very heavily on the power and support of the shugo. So the shugo were provincial military governors appointed by the shogunate, and their primary role was to oversee a particular area's local warriors and keep them in line. Although the shugo sort of functioned alongside the civil governors appointed by the imperial court, once under the Muromachi shogunate, they sort of replaced and eclipsed their civil counterparts. One of the reasons that the shugo position became so powerful was a policy called the Hanzei, or half-share policy of 1351, which allowed them to appropriate half of a province's tax revenue for military purposes, which all went to the shugo. And because of this, we had a great increase in the prestige and allure of the shugo position. And the shugo are often described as the first class, the first stage of daimyo. But that doesn't mean that the shugo were necessarily actually ruling their provinces. In many cases, it was the shugodai, or the deputy shugo, who remained in the province while the shugo resided in Kyoto. And this allowed the shugodai, not the shugo, to establish a foothold in their province. And so owing to a war in Kyoto called the Onin War from 1467 to 1477, 10 years, which really destroyed most of the city. The Ashikaga shoguns mostly lost all of their power, and in the ensuing chaos, the realm came to be controlled by a series of warlords, who we now call the Sengoku daimyo, the daimyo, the warlords of the Warring States period. And most of the Sengoku daimyo were shugodai, so the deputy shugo, so the deputy military governors, or other major lords in the area. Although there were a couple shugo who were able to maintain power, like the Shimazu, who are in what's now Kagoshima in Kyushu, and the Ouchi, who are in Yamaguchi prefecture at the very end of Honshu, close to Kyushu. So the presence of these two rival courts, the northern and southern courts in the 14th century, naturally gave rise to lots of instances of loyalty and desertion. But it wasn't until the Sengoku, the Warring States period, which is usually considered to be 1467 to 1600, did lords attempt to codify, to formalize the practices of rewarding and enforcing loyalty. So the Sengoku period saw the promulgation of kaho, which we call house laws, and kakun, which we call house precepts, by daimyo across the archipelago. The laws and precepts of the various domains were hardly uniform. Not ignore the loyal follower. So Nobushige is suggesting to his own retainers that a follower who's demonstrated his loyalty, who's worked hard for the cause, needs to be rewarded. And if you don't reward your followers, they're going to leave. Which sounds a bit more like a company or a business than it sounds like a master and his retainers. But this was very, very common, especially before 1600. So the 16th century, which is my favorite century, of course, saw a very small number of Sengoku daimyo acquired the resources and allies and manpower to vie for national hegemony, the power to really, hopefully, they wanted to unite the country. But there wasn't a single qualified candidate for this national unification until the 1560s. So we come to Oda Nobunaga, who is the head of a house of relatively modest pedigree. Went to the shogun, but Nobunaga controlled everything, and the shogun didn't like this. He wanted to rule himself, so it really a lot of tension brewed, and after 5 years, this alliance broke down, and Nobunaga emerged as the sole hegemon, and he exiled Yoshiaki, casting him out of Kyoto. But Nobunaga's dominance didn't last for very long, about 9 years, and he was forced to commit suicide in 1582 by one of his own retainers, Akechi Mitsuhide. Hideyoshi. So Hideyoshi successfully fended off his other rivals. Most of them were Nobunaga's other retainers, and he was able to unify Japan by the 1590s. However, Hideyoshi was not successful in establishing a dynasty, and his young son, Hideyori, who was only 5 years old when Hideyoshi died, was overthrown by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600, and Ieyasu was installed as shogun in 1603. And of course, this shogunate lasted until the 1860s. So Hideyori survived, and he would continue to resist he was in Osaka Castle, Osaka Jo, and he continued to resist the Tokugawa until 1615. But then Osaka Castle finally fell to Ieyasu's forces. And as most of you are probably aware, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu are now known as the three unifiers, or tenkabito, of Japan. So like Takeda Nobushige, who established these articles earlier, Nobunaga also understood the importance of recognizing your followers for being loyal. In one letter, he grants his landholding retainers, he orders his landholding retainers to diligently reward their own followers with land grants. Depending on the size of your domain, you should set aside 2 or 3 areas unattached to specific retainers, which you designate as lands to be specially awarded to men who've particularly demonstrated their loyalty, their chūsetsu. If you encourage military exploits, while there are no And ironically, Nobunaga's assassination by Akechi Mitsuhide in 1582 demonstrates that ultimately Nobunaga wasn't successful in eliminating disloyalty. It continued to affect lords throughout the 16th century. So in the 4th month of 1583, less than a year after his forces defeated Mitsuhide, Hideyoshi requested a particular warrior, Saito Gyobu no Jo, to cause trouble in Etchu, which is now modern-day Toyama Prefecture. So Hideyoshi hoped that this sort of disruption would impede the forces of Shibata Katsuie, another one of his rivals in Nobunaga's retainer corps, or Kashindan. So in exchange for his loyalty, Hideyoshi offered to confirm Saito's prior landholdings. I've heard that you recently ensnared Zuisenji and Anyoji in Etchu. Were you to cause them to riot, in recognition of your loyalty, I would confirm your prior landholdings, so please do not be careless. Furthermore, I'd period. Think of the kamikaze pilots of World War II, who probably must have been motivated by a sense of duty to Japan and to the emperor. So House Imagawa-ke, which was a noble and influential warrior house that would be defeated by Nobunaga in 1560, promulgated kaho, or house laws, known as the Imagawa Kana Mokuroku in 1526. One Japanese scholar argues that by employing the concept of the tenka, the kokka, which is often translated as the state or the polity, in their house laws, the Imagawa were trying to conflate themselves with the kokka themselves. So that, in other words, any transgression, any crime against the daimyo, the lord, would have been considered a crime against the whole domain, the whole state, and its residents. So absolute loyalty to the daimyo, who was the personification of the kokka, who represented the kokka, the state, was expected. Whether or not the loyalty to the kokka and the loyalty to the daimyo were distinct, it's undeniable, I think, that the overall goal of these house laws was daimyo control over the domain and the retainer corps, the kashindan. By conflating themselves with the kokka, I think Sengoku daimyo hoped to guarantee the loyalty of those in their domains without relying on transactional loyalty, without having to provide rewards and payments. They hoped that they would follow them just because they represented something greater. The Shimazu Nishin Kyokun, which is a 1561 document issued by the Shimazu family, which was long the dominant daimyo house in Kyushu. It's very well known for being sort of a rebellious house that would always rebel against the center. Also calls for loyalty to the kokka. I think this proves that deontological loyalty, this appeal to a sense of duty, was invoked by daimyo before the three unifiers. Once you get to Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, you see them conflating themselves with the tenka, the realm, which sort of adds this deontological element to their calls for loyalty. In one letter bearing his famous shuinjo, or goshuin, his famous vermilion seal, Nobunaga commanded the Endo family of Mino province to assist him in a campaign against one of his famous betrayers, his brother-in-law, Azai Nagamasa. So the matter on this occasion is of the utmost importance for the realm, for the tenka, for Nobunaga. So if you were to mobilize many men, regardless of age, I would be most pleased with your loyalty. So the wording of this letter indicates that Nobunaga was attempting to convince the Endo family that that which was in Nobunaga's interest was in the interest of the tenka, of the realm. So Nobunaga's use of the phrase for the realm, for Nobunaga, tenka no tame, Nobunaga no tame, suggests that he desired to be recognized as a public authority, or a kogi. It's very similar to the phrase in the UK, your king and country. King equals the country. Nobunaga equals the tenka. And in a 1580 letter addressed to the Shimazu family, Nobunaga again demanded great loyalty toward the realm from the Shimazu. What he actually meant was great loyalty to him, but he's trying to present himself as representing something greater. So this sort of disproves a particular Japanese scholar's claim that the concepts of loyalty and devotion in their current sense seem to have been non-existent in Japan until Toyotomi Hideyoshi, because clearly his predecessor, Nobunaga, was invoking this sense of duty that we would think of now. And I do think that this is a very clear analog comparison to this tenka no tame, Nobunaga no tame, is your king and country need you in the UK. The big difference between these two is that Nobunaga still had rivals in other parts of the country, So unlike King George, who would have been respected by everyone in the country, Nobunaga didn't necessarily have the respect of everyone in Japan, but he was trying to pretend as if he did. One particularly well-known document that was issued again to the Shimazu family by Hideyoshi in 1586, I think perfectly demonstrates the way in which Hideyoshi framed his own authority and demanded the loyalty of the daimyo. In an attempt to end hostilities between the Shimazu and their rivals in Kyushu, the Otomo, so Hideyoshi wrote this particular letter. He's sort of acting as a peacemaker. He's trying to get two houses to cease hostilities. In accordance with the imperial will, I write to you with regards to the state of affairs in Kyushu, as I am tasked by imperial decree with bringing all provinces under heaven, from the Kanto area to the ends of Oshu, to an age of peace. I find the continuing military activities in Kyushu simply unacceptable. With regards to the disagreements surrounding provincial borders, arguments from both sides of the conflict shall be submitted to me for consideration, after which I'll render a final decision. Before this can be done, however, both sides must first completely cease all military actions. Those who refuse to comply with this order will be severely punished. So here I think Hideyoshi is essentially equating himself with the imperial will. And at the stage, of course, he had the support of the emperor, but he's clearly trying to use that to show that if you oppose me, you're opposing the emperor. So in other words, loyalty to Hideyoshi is equivalent to loyalty to the emperor. The loyalty here, I think, is deontological in nature. I think Hideyoshi is expecting absolute loyalty, really nothing less than full submission, on the basis of his position in the imperial house. And not unlike the Sengoku daimyo, who equated themselves with the kokka, and Nobunaga, who saw himself as the embodiment of the tenka, the realm, I think Hideyoshi justified his own authority by associating himself with a greater entity, the emperor. So having introduced the forms of loyalty in pre-modern Japan, at least through my framework, I'd like to, and this has largely been through the perspectives of lords like Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, I'd like to move to a discussion of the loyalty and service of one particular warrior house that served the Ashikaga shogunate and all three unifiers. The Hosokawa were the only link between the Ashikaga, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, Ieyasu, and Akechi Mitsuhide. There is no other warrior who served all those people. The ability of the Hosokawa to thrive under each of the unifiers demonstrates, in my view, that military success was not at all the only path to power in this warring states period, and that things like cultural capital and personal connections, so jinmyaku, were greater determinants of success in the late medieval and early modern period. So the Sengoku period saw the gradual deterioration of Japan's second shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate. In 1565, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru was forced to commit suicide in a coup d'etat. This left Hosokawa Fujitaka, a relative of the shogun who had served him since coming of age, masterless. But Yoshiteru had a younger brother named Yoshiaki, who was serving as a Buddhist monk in Nara, south of Kyoto. Knowing that a similar fate likely awaited Yoshiaki, Fujitaka helped the young man escape from Nara. Shortly thereafter, he began corresponding with several daimyo across the realm, hoping to find one who would be willing to use military strength to help Yoshiaki enter the capital and become shogun. One of these lords was Nobunaga, who expressed his absolute willingness to support Yoshiaki in a letter to Fujitaka in 1565. I have again had the honor of receiving a letter from his lordship concerning the matter of progress, his progress to the capital, and I have read it dutifully. I have repeatedly expressed my acceptance of his offer and am totally determined to accompany his lordship as soon as he gives the order. Accordingly, I think it is in the interest of his lordship to send immediate orders to Echizen and Wakasa provinces. Furthermore, Ogisa Yamato no Kami and Wada Iga no Kami will report additionally on this matter, and I ask you to transmit their message to his lordship. It would take, even though it sounds like Nobunaga is at this point ready to go with Yoshiaki, it would actually take him a few years to actually clear out the other lords in that area. And finally, 3 years later, in 1568, he rode with Yoshiaki into Kyoto, where Yoshiaki was made. This letter, of course, is addressed to Hosokawa Fujitaka, Hosokawa Hyobu no Daibudono. And I think this leaves very little doubt that Fujitaka was a huge key figure in the establishment of this alliance. So thanks to Fujitaka, Nobunaga and Yoshiaki were able to form a coalition government. Yoshiaki brought legitimacy to the table, while Nobunaga contributed his military might. Fujitaka remained a retainer of the shogun while also serving Nobunaga, so he sort of had two masters at the same time. Fujitaka was assigned a small territory at Shoryuji Castle near Kyoto in what's now called Nagaoka Kyoshi. So Yoshiaki was meant mostly to be a largely powerless figurehead, while Nobunaga actually controlled things. So Yoshiaki felt very restricted by Nobunaga, and again, the relationship began to fall apart. Yoshiaki even began to write letters to one of Nobunaga's great enemies, Takeda Shingen, trying to break free of Nobunaga. And in 1572, in a letter that was really only discovered 4 years ago, Nobunaga asked Fujitaka to begin recruiting Yoshiaki's other retainers to his side, hoping that this would force the shogun to give up his fight against Nobunaga. This was released, it was discovered in 2022. It was released to the public in 2024. And I got to see it a couple years before that, which was it's very interesting. The main body of the letter is written by a page. So some sort of lower warrior, but this here, the kao or the monogram, is always done by the Lord himself. So this is all someone else, and only this is the Lord himself. And it's hard to see, but this is Nobunaga here, and it's supposed to be in the form of the kirin, the chirin, the sort of mythical creature there. It's maybe a little bigger than this, but it's not too far off this size. Anyway, it reads in English, it reads, I received your poem commemorating Hassaku, or the Harvest Festival, which is the first day of the 8th month. I'm most thankful for the 2 katabira, these garments that you sent me. This year, none of the other retainers in Kyoto, none of the shogun's other retainers, sent me any letters or gifts. You, on the other hand, Fujitaka, sent me a long sword and a horse at the commencement of spring. You've very kindly continued to associate with me. I rejoice at this. As such, I bestow on you this bay horse. It seems that it is quite comfortable to ride, but I must apologize for causing you so much inconvenience, but this is a critical time. I must ask you to recruit the retainers of the southern region, Yamashiro, Setsu, Kawachi provinces, so Kyoto and the space between Kyoto and Osaka, to my cause, whoever they might be, as long as they'll exert themselves in loyalty to me. Your efforts are essential. So this marked a very short period during which, about a little less than a year, during which Fujitaka, at this point, Nobunaga and Yoshiaki are no longer together, they're enemies. And Fujitaka is still sort of serving as a messenger between them. Yoshiaki probably thinks he's still one of his men, but he's actually working for Nobunaga at this point, and he's trying to weaken Yoshiaki by recruiting other lords to his side. So he's a double agent. This was successful, and it turned a lot of the shogun's other warriors against him. But Yoshiaki did not want to give up. He did not want to return to being sort of a powerless figurehead under Nobunaga. And he was cast out of the capital in 1573, and that was the end of the Ashikaga shogunate. Fujitaka's service to Nobunaga earned him this formal recognition of land rights, which marked his sort of career, beginning of his career as a daimyo. So this is very, very typical. Would just be, it's usually a formula. Just about the only thing you can probably read is Shichigatsu, 7th month, 10th day, Nobunaga. That's probably, and then you can see Hosokawa at the end there, but it's pretty, and you can see Konotabi Ima right at the top left, or top right. But it's a pretty formulaic, and it reads, your loyalty to me on this occasion. So when he's talking about loyalty, he's talking about Fujitaka's loyalty by helping him get rid of Yoshiaki. Your loyalty to me on this occasion was truly marvelous. As such, I grant you all rights to the territory to the west of the Katsura River, the Katsuragawa in Yamashiro province. So this is just west of Kyoto, southwest of Kyoto. Let there be no doubt that you hold absolute authority over this land, as stated above. There are really hundreds and hundreds of these sort of documents of you were loyal, so here's your reward. So teleological and deontological loyalty, I think, motivated Fujitaka to support Nobunaga over Yoshiaki. I think Fujitaka clearly benefited from this arrangement, but he also acted what I think was in the best interest of the realm. Because Yoshiaki, the inexperienced shogun, was not only inexperienced, but also careless, and he knew nothing about how politics worked. And so I think Fujitaka knew that continuing the Ashikaga shogunate would only have a detrimental effect on Kyoto and the realm. I think Fujitaka was the only one of Yoshiaki's retainers to understand that only with a strong figure like Nobunaga would the realm be unified eventually. I think Fujitaka's loyalty wasn't simply to one person or another. I think it was I'd like to think that it was to the realm, a greater loyalty, that he wanted to see the political system stabilize. And so he demonstrated this great loyalty toward the realm under each of the unifiers, not just Nobunaga. So after this was issued in 1573, the next few years saw Nobunaga expanding actions in Kyoto. So he was often asked to use his social capital, his personal connections around Kyoto to further Nobunaga's cause. And this included finding rifles, harquebuses, or hinawaju, or teppo, for the Battle of Nagashino no Tatakai, the cavalry of the Takeda family. And he also was able to manage to recruit carpenters to build Azuchi Castle, which is the great fortress of Nobunaga that was on Lake Biwa, and of course was burned after Nobunaga's death. In 1578, so about 5 years after this document was issued, Fujitaka's son, Hosokawa Tadaoki, was married to the daughter of Akechi Mitsuhide, who of course killed Nobunaga a few years later. So Fujitaka and Mitsuhide were really, really remarkable in that they were newcomers to Nobunaga. They didn't grow up with Nobunaga. They came in around 1568 alongside the shogun, and then rose very quickly to become very, very big. Write the entire thing himself, but he did get. But there is one letter written to the 15-year-old Hosokawa Tadaoki, which basically just says, "Good job, keep doing your best," from Nobunaga, and that's really the only surviving letter that's entirely written by Nobunaga that we know of anywhere, really. So in 1582, of course, Akechi Mitsuhide turned on Nobunaga and forced him to commit suicide at Honnoji, which is a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. And Mitsuhide then wrote to the Hosokawa, hoping that they would help him establish control over the realm. So I understand that both of you, father and son, had no choice but to cut your hair. And so, of course, cutting hair, taking the tonsure would be to take Buddhist vows, sort of, to honor your master and to sort of retire from military life. I was disgruntled by your actions, but I now understand that this was a correct judgment on your part. However, so he's basically asking the Hosokawa to join him, because the Hosokawa once refused to join in with his assassination of Nobunaga, but he's still trying to get them, and Akechi Mitsuhide has a lot of territory, has a lot of men, but he can't do it all on his own. He needs to recruit other people. And so he sent letters to quite a few individuals, and of course, Hosokawa Fujitaka is brother-in-law because their children are married. And he's offering, oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong page there. But he's offering provinces, as he's saying, if you want setsu, I'll give you setsu. If you want wakasa, I'll get you wakasa. So again, you see this sort of transactional loyalty, but he's really urgently trying to recruit the Hosokawa because otherwise he's not going to be able to take over the empire, which of course he doesn't. So even though his own son was married to Mitsuhide's daughter, who's a very famous Christian convert called Hosokawa. They had served the shogun alongside one another, Fujitaka and Mitsuhide, and they had worked together under Nobunaga. But I think Fujitaka, so even though you had maybe some personal loyalty between Hosokawa Fujitaka and Akechi Mitsuhide, I think Fujitaka's loyalty to the realm, to his own master Nobunaga, took precedence over his personal loyalty to Mitsuhide. And of course, a few days later, Hideyoshi rode very quickly. He was near Hiroshima and Okayama. He rode with his army very quickly to Kyoto and killed Akechi Mitsuhide. So it was a smart decision on the Hosokawa's part. And within a few years, Hideyoshi, of course, had unified the Japanese archipelago. The fact that Hosokawa Yusai refused to align himself with the betrayer, with Mitsuhide, really allowed him to form various daimyo. So in a very famous case, the Hosokawa Yusai negotiated with the Shimazu family, because the Shimazu family, again in Kyushu, were very, very wealthy, had been in charge of Kagoshima for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the idea that they would have to serve Hideyoshi, who of course was known as a rat or a monkey, they refused to do this. But Hosokawa Yusai, who's finally serving Hideyoshi, he goes to the Shimazu and he says, is there anything I can do? And what he does is he actually instructs the head of the Shimazu family on poetry, on the wakashu, the kokin wakashu, these ancient poems. And he's able to make a warm enough relationship using his cultural knowledge with the Shimazu that the Shimazu finally give up and they agree to serve Hideyoshi. And Yusai, of course, at this point, Yusai was probably the most famous, one of the top two poets in all of Japan, which is really rare for a warrior. Usually you'd associate the aristocrats with poetry. But by this time, Yusai was one of the greatest poets in all of Japan, and Hideyoshi you'd have what would be called rengakai, or linked verse meetings, where one person would come up with a line, and then you'd go to the next person, you'd try to link these verses together. And Hideyoshi didn't know anything about this, so what he would do is he would ask Hosokawa Yusai to write things for him, and then he'd say, oh, I wrote this. So it is this very interesting role of providing cultural capital to these rulers. Because Hosokawa Yusai, of course, had come from a family that was half warriors, and the mother's side were kuge, were aristocrats. So he had both this warrior background and this aristocratic cultural background. So I believe that this demonstrates that Yusai really helped Hideyoshi maintain a state of peace that lasted until the end of the 16th century, when Hideyoshi died in 1598. So by the time that Tokugawa Ieyasu finally defeats Hideyoshi's young son and establishes a new shogunate in the 17th century in 1603, there were really almost no members of the former shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate, left. So Hosokawa Yusai was really the only person who had survived the vagaries of the Sengoku period. So in 1607, Tokugawa Ieyasu asked Yusai if he could share what he knew about the rules and the customs and the traditions of the shogunate, because Tokugawa Ieyasu was just like Hideyoshi. He had absolutely no culture in his background. And so Yusai wrote up 2 volumes of the traditions of the Ashikaga shogunate and gave them to Ieyasu. So he was sort of a bridge between the medieval and early modern Japan in that way. So of course, Hosokawa Yusai was impressive not only in the political sphere, helping these warlords, but also a major figure in the cultural sphere. His role in helping Nobunaga bring an end to the Ashikaga shogunate was very impressive, but so was his role in Japanese cultural history as one of the top poets of all of Japan. And in 1565, the Hosokawa, who had just lost their master, the Ashikaga, had no territory, had no master, had almost nothing other than their skills, their traditions. But by the 1630s, 20 almost 30 years after the warfare ceased in Japan, the Hosokawa were given all of Kumamoto Prefecture, which is really an enormous chunk of Kyushu. It was the second largest domain in all of Kyushu. So even though what we might think of the Warring States period, this period of violence, we think that of chaos and destruction, and that if you were strong, you would come out on top. Actually, I think that maintaining personal relationships, mastering poetry, and knowing how to be a loyal retainer were also ways to succeed during this violent period. So I think in a world where loyalty was service, the service of the Hosokawa family were their social and their cultural capital. And my feeling is that Hosokawa Yusai represents a loyalty that an affront, a crime against the whole realm. Yet even after they'd begun using this sense of duty and demanding loyalty on it, people like Hideyoshi and Nobunaga were still asking for help by offering rewards transactionally. So a lot of these historians of Japan have avoided the 16th century. It's actually as interesting as it is, subject of many TV dramas like Shogun, very, very well, and lots of video games and manga. It's not particularly well studied, especially in the West. And it's because of all these contradictions. It's very, very hard to organize it into some sort of thesis. But I personally think that by looking at the 16th century, we can look at a transition between this world where everyone's thinking like a businessman transactionally to around 1600, when we have a period where people are demanding loyalty on these more noble ideas of the realm, of the country. And that's the sort of loyalty that we have during the 17 and 1800s, when these samurai are willing to kill themselves for their master. In 1400, 1500, the idea that you would kill yourself for your master was completely unheard of. You were living for yourself and yourself only. So deontological and transactional loyalty seem almost most mutually exclusive. It almost seems absurd to label both of them expressions of loyalty. But even so, these two forms of loyalty coexisted in 16th century Japan and continue to coexist today. Some warriors in the 16th century Japan were capable of seeing beyond self-interest, while others would be willing to desert their lords whenever someone else offered a better reward. And even today, these two disparate, separate conceptions of loyalty continue to coexist. Governments continue to call on citizens to serve their country out of a sense of loyalty, of duty. Some individuals, civil servants, military personnel, maintain a higher loyalty to their country, which doesn't really matter who's in charge. Their loyalty is to this greater notion, which I think is not terribly unlike Yusai. And in the United States, of course, we have presidents who reward loyalty by offering positions in the government, ambassadorial posts, regardless of really what motivated that loyalty. And today, we have lots and lots of politicians who have been loyal or performed loyalty to the current American president, mostly because that's simply in their interest. That loyalty can absolutely be motivated by self-interest, I think, is one of the big takeaways here. So I think that this means that there are indeed quite a few lessons that we can take from the Japanese past and apply them to today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your very explanation. It was so clear and so interesting for me, at least. And I was wondering, do you have any intention of writing or studying about loyalty in modern and contemporary Japan?
So thank you very much for the question. So there have been a few good studies. Of course, when we look at loyalty in the modern period, we'll look at things like there's a historian in the UK. His name is Oleg Benesh at the University of York. He wrote "Inventing the Way of the Samurai," and so when we think about the samurai, we have this image of the samurai as a loyal person who's willing to die, but actually, and maybe in the Showa period during the war, that's maybe what Japanese people thought that their past was. But in reality, you go back to 1550 and you see these things of, you be loyal to me and I give you this reward. And so I think when we look at loyalty, it's always good to take what's called the longue durée, a long period, looking how it changes. So I think when you look at loyalty in the modern period, you can find lots and lots of very, very good examples of, say, the kamikaze pilots, or just how loyal the people were to the emperor during World War II. How people today are loyal to their companies in Japan. You know, they stay at the same company their entire lives. And I would argue that this is a really completely different sort of loyalty than we saw in the medieval period. But often it's kind of presented as being connected. They talk about, the samurai spirit or tradition, but really these traditions were invented more recently and then put back in the past. So my research, I'm currently working on turning my medieval period, or are these really the same sort of ways of thinking about loyalty that are present today? And it's I think it's a continuing thing, but it is something that I'd like to pursue, because there are so many people who said, oh, I love the samurai, they're so loyal to their masters. And you can say, well, no, not always. Sometimes, not always, but you can see this change. And I think my main point of the presentation was to show that there's this shift where finally you do get this idea of devotion to your lord that didn't exist in 1400, but did exist sort of in 1600. And then by 1800, 1900, it's even stronger. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
I'm very happy to answer any questions, if not necessarily about the work presentation, about studying in Japan or doing research in Japan or learning the language. Because I'm really not too far from students really in terms of age. So I'm 29. I spent 5 years in Japan, then was in the UK for my PhD. And I think it's very interesting to see how Japanese studies is done at other places in Europe, and you can end if you want. But I am very happy to share my contact information with Geshin for anyone who'd be interested, and so please do reach out if you're curious, or if you're interested in visiting or studying in the UK. If you're trying to arrange sort of something in Japan too, if I can be of help, I'd be very happy to render my assistance.
Thank you.